idea of 7 years, the 7th year being a year of remission in which both debts and slavery are remitted. I'd like to say something just very briefly about slavery in the Bible, because I know that you're about to come on and think about slavery this morning. Slavery is significantly a part of the whole concept of Jubilee. It's a really difficult one, but it's an important part of it. I'm not going to talk about it at length this morning. That's going to happen a bit tomorrow. But because I've had this introduction, I just want to say something very, very brief about the Bible and slavery. The Bible was written during periods in which slavery was a fact. Slavery was in society. That is how society worked. Everyone accepted it. That was simply how it was. The Bible is neither for slavery nor against it. And that can be really quite difficult for us reading. For the most part, the Bible is simply written against a background in which slavery exists and assumes it. However, there are, I'm glad to say, bits in the Bible where the biblical writers really start to get their teeth into slavery as an issue and think about the justice or injustice of slavery as a practice. And I'm very happy to say that the law of Jubilees is one of those instances. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that tomorrow. It will not go far enough for you, and it probably won't make you very happy, but it is something. And given the fact that slavery was such an important background in the period in which the biblical texts were being written, it counts for something. So I just want to let you know that before you do your thinking this morning, and before we get to think about that in more detail tomorrow. So this has all been background to starting to think about the Jubilee proper. So Elizabeth read us the passage for this morning, and the beginning of Leviticus 25, which began like this. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land that I am giving you, the land shall observe a Sabbath for the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in their yield." Is this sounding familiar, by the way? "But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for..." Were you listening? Can you fill in that gap? "A Sabbath for the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather your grapes of your unpruned vine. It shall be a year of complete rest for... You may eat what the land yields during its Sabbath, you, your male and female slaves, your hired and your bound labourers who lived with you, for your livestock also, and for the wild animals in your land. All its yield shall be for food." So what's the missing word? Land. Land. This is not a year of rest for you. So the reason why you shouldn't be doing all this work on the land isn't rest for you. This is rest for the land. And so the very opening of Leviticus 25, which is the chapter which tells us what the Jubilee is about, tells us that not only does God rest, not only must we rest 1 day a week, the land must have its rest. In the portion of text to which Leviticus 25 belongs, so chapters 17 through to 26, which incidentally is, for those who've done some biblical studies, we're in priestly territory here. In fact, we might call those chapters the Holiness Code, or H. If that means something to you, that's wonderful. If it doesn't, it really doesn't matter. But we're talking about a group of texts which is basically the second half of Leviticus. In those chapters, the land is a character, just like people are. The land is a character, and it acts in some ways of its own volition. So a couple of examples from the text here. I won't read you all of this. From Leviticus 18, we get this extraordinary idea that if the people who are in the land don't follow the law and do what it is that the law asks of them, then the land, which has rather a sensitive stomach, will vomit them out. In Leviticus 26, so right towards the end of this set of chapters, we're told, the land shall enjoy its Sabbath. So Leviticus 25 isn't a one-off. It turns up again. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbath years as long as it lies desolate while you are in the land of your enemies. Then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbath years. As long as it lies desolate, you shall have the rest it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were living on it. What the text is talking about here is the great disaster of the period of the Old Testament writers. In the 6th century BC, the forces of Babylon came and completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the walls, they destroyed the temple, and they found all the richest and best educated people, and they dragged them off into exile in Babylon for 50 years. This is the great disaster of the Old Testament period. Actually, the return at the end of 50 years wasn't brilliant either, but this is the big disaster. And Old Testament texts are full of a range of reasons for why it happened, why God allowed the armies of Babylon to come and defeat Israel, and particularly Jerusalem. It came as a huge shock. The idea always was other places can be defeated. The northern kingdom, well, they were always a dreadful lot. Of course they've been defeated. Jerusalem will never fall. Jerusalem will never fall, but it did. What Leviticus is doing is saying that all of that happened because you failed to allow the land to enjoy its Sabbath. That's why Jerusalem was destroyed and you were carted off into exile. It's because you didn't allow the land to have its Sabbath. So that's how this passage opens. And then it carries on. Then the word Jubilee appears and we really start thinking about Jubilee. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud. On the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement, you shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land. And you shall hallow, or make holy, the 50th year. And you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return, every one of you, to your property, and every one of you to your family. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth or harvest the unpruned vines. For it is a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field itself produces. So those bits of text that I have coloured green, I have coloured green because they're a way into giving us a sense of what the themes of Jubilee are. This is what Jubilee is about. So you shall hallow it, you shall make it holy. So the first thing about Jubilee is that it is holy. It's set apart from other time. You shall proclaim liberty. Jubilee is about the proclamation of liberty. You shall return. Jubilee is like a great factory reset. It's like every 50 years you get to hit the return to factory settings button on your iPhone or on the world and say, put it back to the way it was, to the way that it was set at the outset. Now, this is all subject to something I'm going to say in a moment, but this is a return to God's plan, return to factory settings. You won't sow or reap, you will eat merely what the field produces. So it's not for you to work the land. The land will go on and produce whatever it wants to in the middle of its year of rest, and as it does so, you are welcome to eat it. But you're not allowed to try and make it produce anything, because this is rest for the land. So rest is at the heart of Jubilee. And I hope you're beginning to see that the themes of those periods of 7 that I talked about at the very beginning are coming back here. The ideas of rest, the ideas of remission, of proclamation, of liberty. What the authors of Leviticus 25 are doing is picking up this idea of 7 and literally multiplying it, making it 7 squared, and drawing all the themes from these 7 patterns elsewhere and putting them together with some particular themes. So, what are they? It's a year of holiness. Holiness is about being set apart. So it's a year set apart. It's a return to factory settings. It's about a proclamation of liberty. It's about rest. And it's about innovation. Because although it may not have been obvious completely yet to this point, there are a lot of new ideas included in this concept of Jubilee. And I want to start unpacking one of those ideas now. Jubilee does nothing less than reimagining the relationships between God, the earth, and humanity. It says, how did these 3 relate to one another? How have they related in the past? How is it going to be now? Tomorrow, we are going to spend the session looking at the relationship that Jubilee sets up or confirms or outlines between God and the earth and humans. Today, as you will have already begun to get a little bit of a taste, the theme is what is the relationship between earth and humans? How should it be? What is the factory setting there to which we should be returning? So, let's explore this idea about the relationship between the earth and people. And as with everything begins in Genesis. I'm sure you will agree, for me, it's basically all about Genesis. It's ideally about Abraham, but if you can't do that, we might as well go back to creation. So, there are a couple of different models in Genesis, at the beginning of Genesis, which gives some ideas about how the relationship between humans and the earth should be. The first comes in Genesis 1, towards the end of that great, magnificent, ritualistic litany of God's creation of the world. Towards the end, we read this. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over the wild animals and the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And so God created humankind in God's own image. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over it." This is not a nice, comfortable picture of the relationship between humans and the earth. A lot of the time we want to try and read an idea of stewardship into it. I'm afraid that it doesn't belong there. This word about dominion, this is to do with kingship, and the words about filling the earth and subduing it in particular, where the Hebrew verb for subdue is used in other places in the Hebrew Bible, it's kind of like getting your heel and rubbing something into the ground. It's not pretty language, I am afraid to tell you, this particular patch of Genesis. But this is not Genesis' only image or metaphor or picture of the relationship between humans and earth, because the creation story continues. So up to this point in Genesis 1, as I said, we've got this fabulous kind of creedal, ritualistic, magnificent description of God speaking the world into being. And then once you get into Genesis 2, it kind of all changes. It's a story. It's a real story. And it's a small story because it's a story of just a few people and God, and of these people walking around in the garden together and able to have conversation with God. And something different is going on with this story. Now, any story, to be a good story, has got to have a problem in it. There's got to be some kind of a tension or something wrong or something missing. So let me give you, and as much as we might think we love stories where everyone's happy and it's all nice, and we don't love those stories. If you have a story which is about a large group of people coming to spend 3 or 4 days in a conference centre miles away from anywhere else and none of them get murdered, that is not a story. A story begins with a problem that somehow has to be resolved, and that's the story. Now, often we get ourselves a bit worked up and we think that the story in Genesis 22 is about a whole pile of things. But Genesis 2 tells us at the beginning what the problem is. The problem is that there isn't any water to water the earth. There isn't a system set up, and there aren't people to do it to make sure that the earth is properly watered. So hear this. The core concern at the beginning of Genesis 2 is the well-being of the earth. It's not about who the people were or what gender they were or anything like that. It is the earth. And so God makes a couple of things happen to resolve this problem. First of all, there's a river, and water comes up and it feeds the earth. But what God does then is to create an Adam. Now, I've used a little bit of Hebrew language in here, and I've done that on purpose because I want to show you a little bit about the relationship of some of these things. The word for earth used in Genesis 2, not exclusively but largely, is Adamah. Adamah, the Hebrew noun meaning ground. When God creates the first human, God creates the human from dust, from the Adamah. And what is the human called? Adam. The Adam comes from the Adamah. As Phyllis Tribble says, what we're talking about here is an earth creature, a creature who has been made from the earth. And the earth creature has been created to solve the problem that there is nobody. In the NRSV and other versions, it's to till the earth. The word in Hebrew is ebed, to serve the earth. Now, ebed is a Hebrew word with it includes quite a lot within it. So you can find it either as a noun or as a verb. So as a verb, it means effectively to serve. As a noun, it means either a servant or a slave. So the human is created to be a slave, in effect, to the earth. And so God puts the human in the garden so that God can do that. So a little bit later in the chapter, the Lord God took the Adam and put him, incidentally, there's a very good Hebrew word for put, but it's not used here. The word that's used here is manukah, rest. God caused the earth creature to rest in the garden, to till it, to serve it and keep it. And then a few verses later, then God said, "It is not good that the man, the Adam, should be alone. I will make for him a helper, an Ezer, as his partner." So the woman is created, but she's not created so that the two of them can have afternoon tea together. She is created for a purpose, just as the Adam is created for a purpose, and that purpose is to serve the earth. So according to Genesis 2, the purpose of humans is to serve the earth. The earth comes first here, just as it did in Leviticus 25. Do you remember we began with the earth shall have its Sabbath? This begins with the earth here as well. Now, if you have done biblical studies, you may well be wanting to jump up and down in your seat and say, but this isn't P. This has got nothing to do with it. Come and have a coffee with me afterwards and I'll talk to you about it. You're absolutely right, but there's a reason why that's not the end of the world. And for many of you, you will be blissfully unencumbered by the problem that this is not P and it won't matter to you. So here are two models at the very beginning of Genesis that talk about how humankind should relate to the earth. It's just before I leave this, I just want to make one further point about this and the language and the pairings. Once there are two humans, the Adam is not the Adam any longer. The Adam becomes an Ish, a man, and the second creature becomes an Ishar, a woman. So you can see once again there's that relationship built through language, just as there was the relationship between earth and the human. And so the Hebrew reflects all of this. And so it's great to learn Hebrew because you can find some of these things out. And here ends my plug for Hebrew. So here are the two models right at the very beginning of our biblical text for thinking about how humans and the earth should relate to one another. And which of those two models do you think that Leviticus 25 picks up? The second one. The second one is the model for Leviticus 25. This picture is an artist's impression of what a ziggurat in Babylon might have looked like. Usually we don't see, if we see pictures of it, it's usually just stone walls, but it's thought that actually what we've got here is essentially a garden. And you will have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the wonders of the ancient, seven wonders of the ancient world. I talked a moment ago about the disaster in which the people were carted off to spend 50 years in Babylon. While they were there, they had an opportunity to get a taste for the Babylonian fondness for gardens. They also had a taste of what it was like to be expelled from your place and your land. And there's a very good argument to be made that right at the beginning of Israel's story, Israel tells a story of what it is like to be expelled from your land and sent away from the beautiful garden. Now, while the people were in Babylon, they picked up all sorts of ideas and stories from the locals, because when you're somewhere for 50 years, that's what you do. And the Hebrew writers were masters at borrowing things from other peoples, but never exactly as they found them. So one of the ideas that was borrowed from this world of the ziggurat was the idea of the God as the master of the ziggurat and all of the peoples as God's slave. But the change, so basically in the Babylonian concept, and we get it in the Babylonian creation stories, people were created to look after the gods, basically to tie up their hammocks and bring them cocktails. That's what human beings were in the stories of the surrounding ancient Near Eastern nations. For our biblical writers, human beings were not created to look after God. Human beings were created to look after the earth. And that's the way in which the story of the picture of Babylon was picked up and incorporated, but changed to make it uniquely Hebrew and to reflect this idea of the human being as the servant of God's creation, the earth. Now, this isn't, none of this is entirely unique. We get some of these ideas elsewhere as well. I've just put the text here again, just as a reminder about the focus of the land and for rest at the beginning of this text. This idea about the relationship between human beings and land is not unique to this idea in the Hebrew Bible, but it is shared by many indigenous peoples around the world. In fact, there's an argument which says that Western culture has to some extent lost this idea of the relationship, and we have this crazy notion that one can and ought to own land, that it is something we can own, that can belong to us. And that's where we're going tomorrow, is to be going to part of what we're doing tomorrow. So think about this idea that humans can own land. This is a piece of Aboriginal dot painting. Its name is Secret Men's Business. I chose it for a particular reason, which might become apparent just in a moment. Australian school children are taught that Australian Aboriginal peoples believe that it is not possible to own the land, although all Australian Aboriginals have a very strong connection with the land and with a particular area of the land. They do not own it. It's more like it owns them. In fact, it is their mother. And their responsibility is to take care of the land. And that is a relationship of responsibility. And that's the reason why in Australia you're not allowed to climb Ayers Rock, Uluru, anymore. It's because the traditional owners, the language is unfortunate, but the traditional caretakers of that land become responsible for the deaths of silly people who want to climb that rock because that seems to be an interesting thing to do. My doctoral supervisor in Melbourne, who has done a lot of work around the Hebrew Bible and land, and has also worked in the Lands Department on the Indigenous Australians desk, and got to know quite a bit about this. He's told me the story that a group of Aboriginal elders came to him and said, "We've been hearing about this book, Leviticus, and we're kind of interested because its ideas seem to be remarkably similar to some of the ideas that we think about land. Will you tell us about that, please? And come and talk to us." So he went and sat on the ground with them for a week and talked to them about Leviticus. And boy, I wish I had been there. That would have been quite something. So that's why it's called Secret Men's Business, because effectively this is what this became. So, a sprawling introduction to Jubilee and what Jubilee is all about. Some of it we've seen, some more of it we're going to see tomorrow. Jubilee is about holiness and being set apart. It is an opportunity to return to factory settings. It is about the proclamation of liberty, more on that tomorrow. It's about rest, and it's about innovation and change. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
That was so wonderful. That was so gripping and so engaging. And it reminded me of my husband, who is into eco-theology and reading books and writing. And now and then we have this discussion about, well, what is dominion actually about? So I shall go home and tell you exactly what you've said about stewardship. Sorry, should I repeat myself?
No.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
So, I'm Elizabeth Welsh, a former moderator